How could a crumbling, sanctioned state on the edge of the Persian Gulf quietly become the pressure point that unravels Beijing's entire century-long strategy? Why would China, not Iran, not the US, be the country most exposed if that relationship breaks down? Let's get into it. Iran is China's Achilles heel, and if you stay until the end of this video, you will never look at the US-China rivalry the same way again. Picture the Strait of Hormuz on a Tuesday morning. The tankers are gone. Not sunk, not seized, just gone. Rerouted, grounded and held back by insurance companies that will no longer underwrite a war zone. In a single morning, roughly 21 million barrels of oil stop moving. That is not a statistic. That is the moment the global economy starts holding its breath. Shipping rates do not rise gradually when Hormuz goes quiet. They detonate. In 2019, after a handful of tanker attacks in the Gulf, freight rates on certain routes spiked over 300% within weeks. That was a skirmish, a rumour, not a closure. A full blockade or sustained military escalation would trigger a pricing shock that makes 2019 look like a dress rehearsal. The West tends to absorb stories like this through a particular lens. Oil prices spike. American consumers pay more at the pump. Washington scrambles diplomatically. That framing is not wrong. But it is dangerously incomplete, because the country watching that Tuesday morning with real terror is not sitting in Washington. It is sitting in Beijing. Here is the myth the Western media has spent decades quietly reinforcing. The United States is hooked on Middle Eastern oil, and that dependency is Washington's great geopolitical vulnerability. It makes for a compelling headline. It is also largely obsolete. The shale revolution restructured American energy so completely that by the early 2020s, the US had become the world's largest oil producer. Washington still cares about Gulf stability, but it cares the way a landlord cares about a neighborhood it no longer lives in. The concern is real. The existential exposure is not. Asia tells a completely different story. Japan imports nearly 90% of its oil from the Middle East. South Korea is not far behind. India's dependency runs deep and is growing as its economy accelerates. And then there is China, the world's largest crude importer, pulling somewhere between 40 and 50% of its total oil supply directly from the Gulf region, with Iran functioning as one of its most critical and most discreet suppliers. This is not a footnote, it is the central fact that reframes the entire US-China rivalry. Every time Washington tightens its grip around Gulf politics, every diplomatic maneuver, every carrier strike group repositioned in the Arabian Sea, it is not primarily threatening American interests. It is sending a message directly to Beijing. The media missed the plot. The strategists in Washington did not. The question is what Beijing built in response and just how exposed that construction left them. Most people, when they hear the Belt and Road Initiative, picture a road, maybe a railway. Perhaps a port somewhere in Africa is being built with Chinese money and Chinese labour. That image is not inaccurate. It is just far too small. The Belt and Road is better understood as a global operating system. It is Beijing's attempt to physically rewire the world's trade infrastructure so that the dominant routes, the choke points, the transshipment hubs and the financing mechanisms all run through Chinese-controlled or Chinese-aligned architecture. It is a strategy disguised as construction. Within that system, the West Asia Economic Corridor occupies a position of extraordinary strategic weight. This is the artery that runs from China through Central Asia and into the Middle East, designed to move goods, energy and capital westward toward Europe without ever touching a sea lane that the US Navy patrols. On paper, it is elegant. A continental bypass around American maritime dominance, and at the very center of that corridor, functioning as the indispensable geographic pivot between the Caspian, the Gulf, and the Mediterranean, sits one country, Iran. Remove it, and the corridor does not slow down, it fractures. The operating system does not lag, it crashes. Beijing did not build the Belt and Road to be fragile, but in anchoring its westward ambitions to a single, sanctioned, internally volatile state, it introduced a vulnerability that no amount of infrastructure spending can fully insure against. Pull up a map and look at Iran with fresh eyes. To the north, the Caspian Sea and the former Soviet republics of Central Asia. To the east, Afghanistan and the overland routes into Pakistan and Western China. To the south, the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea. To the west, Iraq, Turkey and the gateway into the Levant and Europe. No other single country on Earth sits at the intersection of that many strategic corridors simultaneously. Geographers sometimes use the term transcontinental hinge to describe a nation whose territory connects otherwise separated regions of the world. Iran is not just a hinge, it is the hinge that Beijing needs most. For China's Belt and Road ambitions to function as designed, goods moving westward from Xinjiang need somewhere to land before they can continue into the Gulf states or push toward European markets. Iranian rail infrastructure, Iranian ports on the Gulf, Iranian road networks cutting through the Zagros Mountains. These are not optional conveniences. They are load-bearing walls in the architecture of Beijing's westward expansion. The Chinese understood this before they signed a single contract in Tehran. The 25-year strategic partnership inked in 2021, worth an estimated $400 billion in investment, was not charity. It was Beijing purchasing irreplaceable geography. The problem is that geography cannot be sanctioned, but the government sitting on top of it absolutely can, and Washington has spent years making sure the world remembers that. Imagine spending $400 billion building a highway and then discovering that the central bridge can be bombed at any moment by your primary rival. That is not a hypothetical. That is the precise situation Beijing has engineered for itself inside Iran. The investments are staggering in their specificity. Chinese state firms have poured capital into Iranian rail corridors connecting Tehran to the Afghan border. They have financed port expansion at Bandar Abbas, the critical outlet onto the Strait of Hormuz. They have built special economic zones, energy processing facilities, and telecommunications infrastructure. Each project was designed to function as a node in a larger network. But here is the problem with nodes. They require the network to survive in order to generate returns. The moment Iran destabilizes, whether through regime collapse, military conflict, or a sanctions regime so severe that the domestic economy can no longer maintain the infrastructure, those assets do not just underperform, they go dark. A railway that terminates in a failed state does not collect tolls. A port in a war zone does not process container ships. The billions already spent do not disappear from the balance sheet, but they stop producing the strategic leverage they were purchased to create. Beijing would be left holding an inventory of expensive, inaccessible, effectively frozen infrastructure in a country the rest of the world refuses to do business with. Dead assets in the most consequential geography on Earth. Numbers are easy to cite, they are harder to feel. So before the figures, consider the image. Every single day, somewhere between 1 and 2 million barrels of Iranian crude oil make their way into Chinese refineries, tankers sailing under flags of convenience, transponders switched off, port records quietly adjusted, a shadow fleet operating at industrial scale, moving sanctioned oil across open water because Beijing calculated that the risk of getting caught is lower than the risk of going without. That calculation tells you everything about the dependency. China's strategic petroleum reserves offer a temporary buffer, roughly 90 days of supply at normal consumption rates according to most independent estimates. That sounds substantial until you realize that a prolonged disruption of Iranian supply does not present itself as a clean, manageable crisis. It arrives alongside spiking spot prices, panicked Asian markets, and rival buyers competing for every available barrel on the open market. The replacements do not exist in volume. Saudi Arabia can adjust output but is simultaneously managing its own political relationship with Washington. Russia can supply, but is operating under its own sanctions architecture with constrained export capacity. The spot market can absorb short-term gaps. It cannot replace a structured, long-term, below-market supply arrangement built into the operational budget of the world's largest manufacturing economy. Iran is not a supplier China chose for convenience. It is a supplier China chose because the price, the volume, and the political arrangement were irreplaceable. That is not a trade relationship. That is a dependency. And dependencies, once exposed, become weapons. The question is, who picked up that weapon first? Energy is the obvious vulnerability, but there is a layer of the China-Iran relationship that receives far less attention, and it may matter even more. That layer is political leverage. Iran sits at the intersection of every conflict Washington cares about in the Middle East. It has direct influence over Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, Shia militias in Iraq, and the Assad government in Syria. Its nuclear program has consumed American diplomatic bandwidth for 3 consecutive decades. Its relationship with Russia complicates NATO's eastern calculations. Tehran is, by any serious measure, one of Washington's most persistent and resource-intensive geopolitical problems, and Beijing holds a quiet but meaningful position of influence with Tehran. That influence does not make China a peacemaker. It makes China a variable that the US must account for in every regional calculation. Want to tighten sanctions on Iran? Beijing will absorb the oil and blunt the financial pressure. Want to negotiate a nuclear deal? Iran will check its relationship with China before deciding how much latitude it has at the table. Want to project military force in the Gulf? Beijing's economic stakes in the region now make that calculus more complicated for Washington. This is leverage measured not in weapons but in dependency chains and veto power. China does not threaten to intervene militarily in the Middle East. It simply exists there, financially and diplomatically, in ways that constrain American freedom of action. Losing Iran would not just cost Beijing an energy supplier, it would cost Beijing a piece on the board. When analysts begin to feel uncomfortable about China's Iranian exposure, they almost always reach for the same solution: the Middle Corridor. Also called the Trans-Caspian International Transport Route, it runs from China through Kazakhstan, crosses the Caspian Sea by ship, enters Azerbaijan, and then threads through Georgia and Turkey toward European markets. It bypasses Russia. It bypasses Iran. On the surface, it looks like a credible alternative. Look closer. The Middle Corridor currently handles a fraction of the cargo volume that the Iranian land routes can absorb. The Caspian crossing alone introduces a multimodal bottleneck that larger belt and road shipments cannot efficiently navigate. Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan have meaningful infrastructure gaps that would require years of sustained investment to close. Turkey, while a willing participant, operates its own foreign policy agenda that does not always align with Beijing's preferences, and none of these workarounds addresses the energy dependency. The Middle Corridor moves goods. It does not move oil at the volume or price that Beijing currently extracts from its Iranian arrangement. There is also the question of timing. The infrastructure of this complexity is not rerouted in a crisis. It has been built over decades. If Iran destabilizes suddenly, China cannot pivot to the Middle Corridor the way a logistics company reroutes a parcel. It absorbs the disruption, burns through its reserves, and improvises in a market that immediately prices in its vulnerability. The Middle Corridor is a real asset, but it is not a replacement. It is a lifeboat on a ship that was never supposed to sink. Here is what the Belt and Road Initiative survives if Iran falls. The African infrastructure projects survive. The South Asian port investments survive. The Central Asian rail corridors survive. The digital Silk Road survives. Pieces of the architecture remain intact because Beijing had the foresight to build redundancy into the outer edges of the network. Here is what does not survive. The ambition. The entire strategic logic of pushing Belt and Road westward, through the Middle East, into the Mediterranean, and ultimately into the economic architecture of Europe, rests on the Iranian hinge. Without it, the West Asia Economic Corridor becomes a series of expensive, disconnected projects rather than a coherent system. The dream of Beijing as the operating centre of Eurasian trade, as the power that bridged Asia and Europe through its own controlled infrastructure, does not disappear quietly. It collapses visibly, in slow motion, measured in stranded assets and rerouted ambitions. That is the US masterstroke, not a military victory, not a direct confrontation, a structural one. Washington does not need to defeat the Belt and Road. It only needs to destabilize the one country Beijing cannot replace, often enough and severely enough that the investment calculus stops making sense. China built a strategy for the century, and somewhere along the way, it handed its primary rival a single pressure point capable of hollowing out the entire enterprise. The trap was not set by Beijing. It was walked into, deal by barrel over 25 years, and Washington has been watching every step.